There were blues musicians 100 years ago that every American in the Mississippi Delta, every sharecropper in Texas, every worker in the Chicago stockyards knew by name. They packed theaters, they sold records by the hundreds of thousands. But when the music industry decided who would be remembered and who would not, most of them were left out. These 25 blues musicians every single American knew, before history forgot them. Before we get into it, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next look back at what America lost. Number 25, Ida Cox. Ida Cox recorded for Paramount Records beginning in 1923 and became one of the best-selling blues artists of the decade, known as the uncrowned Queen of the Blues. She wrote her own material at a time when few performers, male or female, controlled their own songs. Her recordings sold in the hundreds of thousands across the American South, passed hand to hand in communities that had no other way to hear music made specifically for them. Cox understood the blues not as entertainment, but as testimony. Her songs documented the specific grief and resilience of black women in the American South with a directness that nothing else in popular music attempted. She left behind a body of recordings that are still studied and performed, and the model of the blues artist as a writer who speaks from lived experience rather than commercial calculation. Number 24, Sippy Wallace. Sippy Wallace arrived in Chicago from Texas in the early 1920s and began recording for Oki Records in 1923, becoming one of the most commercially successful blues singers of the decade. She wrote and arranged her own material, played piano, and fronted a touring band at a time when black female performers were expected to be purely interpretive rather than compositional. Her records reached communities across the country through the race records market, the parallel record industry built specifically for black American audiences that the mainstream industry refused to serve. She left behind songs that treated the interior lives of black women as worthy of serious musical attention, and a recording legacy that directly influenced the next generation of blues and R&B performers who followed her out of Texas. Number 23rd, Victoria Spivey. Victoria Spivey was 17 years old when she recorded Black Snake Blues for OK Records in 1926, and it became one of the best-selling blues records of the year. She had been performing in Houston and Dallas since her early teens, absorbing the Texas blues tradition and developing a vocal style that was simultaneously rough and precise, the kind of voice that sounded like it had already lived everything it was singing about. Spivey was also a businesswoman in a way that most performers of her era were not. She eventually founded her own record label, Spivey Records, in 1961, which she used to document and preserve blues performers who would otherwise have gone entirely unrecorded. She left behind not just her own recordings, but an archive of other people's music that would have been lost without her deliberate decision to preserve it. Number 22, Peg Leg Howell. Peg Leg Howell was recorded for Columbia Records in Atlanta beginning in 1926 and became one of the defining voices of the Georgia blues tradition, a regional sound that was distinct from the Delta blues of Mississippi and the East Texas tradition, rougher and more percussive, rooted in the specific soil of the Deep South Piedmont. He lost his leg to a gunshot wound before his recording career began, and he performed for years on the streets of Atlanta before the record companies arrived. His recordings capture a style of pre-commercial blues performance, loose and conversational, built around the immediate relationship between the performer and the people listening, that the more polished recording sessions of the late 1920s and 1930s would gradually smooth away. He left behind some of the most unmediated documentation of what the blues actually sounded like before the industry shaped it into a product. Number 21, Frank Stokes. Frank Stokes recorded for Paramount Records beginning in 1927 and was one of the most popular performers in Memphis for years before any record company even noticed he existed. He led a duo with Dan Sain called the Beale Street Sheiks, and their recordings of Memphis dance music, more rhythmic and celebratory than the mournful Delta blues tradition, sold consistently throughout the South. Stokes represents something the historical narrative of the blues tends to flatten. The blues was not only grief, it was also a party. It was the music people danced to at Saturday night suppers after 6 days of labor on someone else's land. Frank Stokes understood that function and served it with complete commitment. He left behind recordings that documented the celebratory dimension of the blues tradition that the myth of the lonely Delta singer has largely buried. Number 20, Gus Cannon. Gus Cannon led Cannon's Jug Stompers, a Memphis-based ensemble that recorded for Victor Records in 1927 and 1928, and produced some of the most joyful and complex music in the entire pre-war blues and folk catalog. The jug band format, a combination of guitar, banjo, kazoo, jug, and whatever other instruments were available, was itself a statement about making music from what you had rather than what you were supposed to have. Cannon had been performing since the 1890s and brought to his recordings an understanding of the full arc of Black American vernacular music that almost no other recorded artist of the period could claim. He left behind recordings that are still studied by musicologists and have been covered by folk revival artists from the 1960s onward. The song Walk Right In, which he recorded in 1929, became a #1 pop hit in 1963 by the Rooftop Singers, 34 years after Cannon made it. Number 19, Jim Jackson. Jim Jackson recorded for Vocalion Records in 1927, and his recording, Jim Jackson's Kansas City Blues, sold over 500,000 copies, making it one of the best-selling race records of the decade. He had been a fixture of the Memphis Medicine Show circuit for years before the record companies arrived. He performed for crowds who had gathered to buy patent medicine, and he stayed after the sale to keep the crowd entertained. The Medicine Show circuit was the primary performance infrastructure for black musicians in the South before recording and radio created alternative paths to audiences. Jim Jackson knew how to hold a crowd across class lines, across temperament, across weather and circumstances that no concert hall would tolerate. He left behind recordings that capture the specific energy of a performance tradition that existed to serve people, not to impress critics. Number 18, Henry Thomas. Henry Thomas was born in 1874 and recorded for Vocalion Records in 1927 and 1928, making him one of the oldest musicians ever to appear on early commercial blues recordings. He had been performing since the 1880s. The music he recorded was not the Delta blues that would define the genre's identity in subsequent decades. It was something older, a combination of field hollers, dance music, and songster tradition that predated the blues as a named category. His recordings represent one of the few documented windows into the musical world that existed before the blues solidified into a recognizable form. He played the quills, a panpipe instrument of African origin, alongside his guitar, a combination that no other recorded artist of the era used. He left behind evidence of a musical tradition that was already ancient when he recorded it and that has almost entirely disappeared from American music since. Number 17, Barbecue Bob. Robert Hicks, known as Barbecue Bob, recorded for Columbia Records beginning in 1927 and became one of the most commercially successful Georgia blues artists of the decade. He was distinguished by his use of a 12-string guitar at a time when most Delta and Georgia blues guitarists played 6-string. The 12-string produced a fuller, richer sound that gave his recordings an immediate sonic distinction. He worked as a cook at a barbecue restaurant near Atlanta when he was discovered by a Columbia talent scout, and he continued working that job while recording and performing throughout the late 1920s. He died in 1931 at 29 years old from pneumonia. His entire recording career lasted 4 years. He left behind 29 recordings that document one of the most distinctive guitar voices in the pre-war Georgia blues tradition, created and completed before he was 30 years old. Number 16, Skip James. Nehemiah Curtis. James, known as Skip James, recorded for Paramount Records in 1931. He developed a guitar tuning and fingerpicking style in the Mississippi Delta that was unlike anything any other recorded artist was doing, producing a sound that was simultaneously ancient and deeply strange. His recordings sold poorly when they were released. Paramount Records was collapsing and could not effectively distribute them. James stopped performing almost entirely after the session and was not heard from publicly again until 1964, when blues researchers found him in a Mississippi hospital and brought him to the Newport Folk Festival. He was 61 years old and had not performed publicly in over 30 years. The audience that heard him at Newport was hearing something that had been locked away for 3 decades. He left behind a body of work that influenced Cream, Led Zeppelin, and the entire electric blues revival without ever knowing it. Number 15, Lonnie Johnson. Lonnie Johnson recorded over 500 sides for various labels between 1925 and 1932, and he is the most prolific and versatile blues guitarist of the pre-war era. He was the first guitarist to play single-note melodic solos on the blues guitar, rather than using the instrument only as rhythmic accompaniment. That makes him one of the most technically important figures in the entire history of American popular music. Johnson worked with Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, and he crossed so many genre lines that the blues canon has never quite known what to do with him. He was too sophisticated for the rural blues narrative and too rooted in the blues tradition to be claimed by jazz. He left behind recordings that influenced Charlie Christian, whose playing shaped the course of jazz guitar, and through that chain, rock guitar as well. The line from Lonnie Johnson's single-note guitar work to virtually every electric guitar solo recorded in the last 80 years is direct and documentable. Number 14, Blind Blake. Arthur Blake, known as Blind Blake, recorded for Paramount Records beginning in 1926 and produced some of the most technically accomplished guitar playing ever captured on early recording equipment. He specialized in a style called ragtime blues, a combination of blues melody and ragtime rhythm played simultaneously on a single guitar, and it requires a level of independence between the two hands that very few guitarists have ever achieved. Almost nothing is known about his life. His birthplace is disputed, his death date is uncertain. His real name may not have been Arthur Blake. He recorded over 80 sides for Paramount between 1926 and 1932, and then disappeared entirely from the historical record. No photograph of him is confirmed to exist. He left behind 80 recordings of extraordinary guitar playing produced by a man whose life was so thoroughly undocumented that he might as well have materialized from the air to make them. That absence is itself a testimony to how little the world considered it worth recording who these people were. Number 13, Sleepy John Estes. John Adam Estes, known as Sleepy John, recorded for Victor Records in 1929 and developed a style of blues singing that was as close to spoken autobiography as in anything in the recorded tradition. He sang about specific people, specific places, and specific events in and around Brownsville, Tennessee, with a directness that made his recordings function as oral history as much as music. His voice had a quality of genuine exhaustion in it, not performed weariness, but the sound of a man who had actually been tired for a long time. Estes went blind in the 1940s and disappeared from public life entirely. Like Skip James, he was found by blues researchers in the 1960s, still living in Brownsville, still playing. When they found him, he was living in a shack with no electricity. He had no idea his records were known outside his immediate community. He left behind an approach to blues songwriting, the specific name, the specific place, the actual event. That is the foundation of the confessional tradition in American music. Number 12, Tampa Red. Hudson Woodbridge, known as Tampa Red, arrived in Chicago from Florida in the mid-1920s and became one of the most commercially successful and prolific blues recording artists of the pre-war era. He developed a bottleneck slide guitar style using a glass slide rather than the metal slides more common in the Delta tradition, producing a cleaner and more melodic sound that was ideally suited to the recorded medium. Tampa Red's apartment in Chicago became an informal rehearsal space and a gathering point for the community of blues musicians who had migrated north, and his generosity with younger musicians shaped the careers of performers who would define the electric blues era that followed. He left behind over 300 recordings and the model of the blues musician as a community anchor, someone whose home and whose knowledge belonged to the people coming up behind him. Number 11, Memphis Minnie. Lizzie Douglas, known as Memphis Minnie, was one of the finest guitar players, male or female, of the pre-war blues era. She recorded for Columbia Records beginning in 1929 and produced a body of work across the following 2 decades that established her as a complete blues artist in the fullest sense, composer, guitarist, vocalist, and performer who could hold her own against any musician of her generation. She was known in Chicago blues circles for winning guitar contests against male competitors, including a legendary contest against Big Bill Broonzy that Broonzy himself later conceded she won. She left behind over 200 recordings and the proof that the blues had no gender requirement, that the music could be created and performed with equal authority by anyone willing to put in the work of mastering it. Every female guitarist who has ever played the blues owes something to what Memphis Minnie established in those Columbia sessions beginning in 1929. Number 10, Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith recorded for Columbia Records beginning in 1923 and became the best-selling blues artist of the decade, known as the Empress of the Blues. Her voice was the largest instrument in American popular music, not in volume but in emotional range, in the ability to move from tenderness to fury to grief within a single phrase without any of it sounding performed. She sold hundreds of thousands of records at a time when records were expensive and record players were not yet in every home. People bought them anyway because her voice was worth the cost. When the Depression hit and record sales collapsed, Columbia dropped her. She continued performing on the theater circuit. She died in a car accident in Mississippi in 1937. She left behind 160 recordings that are still in print, still studied, and still capable of stopping a room when played. No voice in American popular music before or since has done what hers did. Number 9, Son House. Eddie James House, known as Son House, recorded for Paramount Records in 1930 in a session that produced some of the most intense performances in the entire pre-war blues catalog. He had been a preacher before he was a blues musician, and the conflict between those two identities, the church and the juke joint, salvation and damnation, was the subject of his music in a way that was not metaphorical but literal. He actually lived that conflict every day. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above. His 1930 Paramount recordings were pressed in small quantities and almost entirely disappeared. He too was found by blues researchers in the 1960s, living in Rochester, New York, having stopped performing entirely. He did not remember making the records. The researchers played them for him, and he listened to his own voice from 30 years earlier as though hearing a stranger. He left behind those 1930 recordings and the performances he gave after his rediscovery, which were filmed and which show what the blues looked like when it came from somewhere real rather than somewhere practiced. Number 8, Ma Rainey. Gertrude Pridgett, known as Ma Rainey, was performing the blues in tent shows and on the theater circuit before anyone had thought to record it, and when Paramount Records finally brought her into a studio in 1923, she was already in her 30s with 20 years of performing experience behind her. She was called the Mother of the Blues, not as a marketing claim, but as a genuine designation of seniority. She was the elder of an art form that was still defining itself. She recorded over 100 sides for Paramount between 1923 and 1928, accompanied by some of the finest jazz musicians of the era, including Louis Armstrong. She was open about her sexuality and her personal life in a way that was genuinely unusual for the period. She left behind recordings that document the fully formed blues tradition as it existed before the record companies arrived to shape it, and she left a legacy as a performer and band leader that established the standard every subsequent blues vocalist has been measured against. Number 7, Lead Belly. Huddie Ledbetter, known as Lead Belly, recorded for the Library of Congress beginning in 1933, when folklorists John and Alan Lomax found him serving a sentence at the Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana. His repertoire was enormous, including 12-string guitar, folk songs, work songs, blues, spirituals, prison songs, and dance tunes, accumulated across decades of performance in the Deep South that predated the recording industry entirely. Leadbelly carried in his memory a musical tradition that had been developing for generations before anyone thought to document it. The Lomaxes understood what they were hearing and recorded everything they could. He left behind a catalog that includes Goodnight Irene, Midnight Special, Bring Me Little Water, Sylvie, and Black Betty, songs that have been covered by hundreds of artists across every genre and that remain in active circulation nearly a century after he recorded them. The debt that American folk music, rock and roll, and country music owe to Leadbelly is so large it has become invisible through familiarity. Number 6, Mississippi John Hurt. John Smith Hurt recorded 10 sides for OK Records in 1928 in 2 sessions that produced some of the most quietly beautiful recordings in the pre-war blues and folk catalog. His guitar style was unlike anything else being recorded, a finger-picking approach that was simultaneously rhythmic and melodic, conversational and precise, technically accomplished in a way that sounded effortless because he had been playing it since childhood. OK Records dropped him when the Depression hit. He returned to farming in Avalon, Mississippi, and was not heard from again for 35 years. When blues researcher Tom Hoskins found him in 1963, still living in Avalon, still playing, Hurt was 71 years old. His 1963 recordings sound essentially identical to his 1928 recordings. The style was so complete and so personal that 35 years of silence had not changed it at all. He left behind 20 sessions worth of recordings and the proof that some music is too specific to be improved by anything the industry might do to it. Number 5, Blind Lemon Jefferson. Lemon Henry Jefferson, known as Blind Lemon, recorded for Paramount Records beginning in 1926 and became the best-selling male blues artist of the decade. He was born blind in Couchman, Texas, and had been performing on the streets of Dallas since his teens. His guitar playing was unlike anyone else's, a single-string lead style that anticipated the electric blues guitar of the 1940s and 1950s by 2 decades, played with a technical fluency that nobody who heard him could fully explain. Jefferson recorded nearly 100 sides for Paramount between 1926 and 1929. He died in Chicago in December 1929, alone in a snowstorm, and the circumstances of his death were never fully determined. He was in his 30s. He left behind recordings that directly influenced Robert Johnson, who influenced the Rolling Stones, who influenced every rock guitarist who came after them. The lineage from Blind Lemon Jefferson to contemporary popular music runs through every style that grew from the blues, and that is every style worth naming. Number 4, Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton recorded for Paramount Records in 1929 and is considered by most blues scholars to be the single most important figure in the development of the Delta blues tradition, the rough, intense, rhythmically complex guitar and vocal style that became the foundation of American popular music in the 20th century. He was a performer of extraordinary physical presence who reportedly played guitar behind his head, threw it in the air, and used the body of the instrument as a percussive element while maintaining the song. Those theatrics would not appear again in American popular music until the electric era, 40 years later. He performed at fish fries and juke joints across the Mississippi Delta for years before the record companies arrived. He left behind 30-something recordings made before his death in 1934, and a musical template, the Delta Blues, that every subsequent development in American popular music has been building on or reacting against. Number 3, Big Bill Broonzy. William Lee. Conley Brunzie, known as Big Bill, began recording in 1927 and produced more recordings across more styles than almost any other blues musician of his generation. He could play country blues, city blues, ragtime, gospel, and folk with equal authority, and he performed for audiences on 3 continents across a career that stretched from the pre-war Delta tradition to the European folk revival of the 1950s. When Muddy Waters and the electric blues musicians arrived in Chicago and made the acoustic blues sound old-fashioned, Brunzie reframed himself as a folk musician and went to Europe, where audiences received him as a cultural ambassador for American vernacular music. He performed in England, France, and Belgium for audiences who had never heard anything like him, and who understood immediately that what they were hearing needed to be preserved. He left behind over 300 recordings and a late career documentation of the acoustic blues tradition that the electric era might otherwise have entirely displaced. Number 2, Robert Johnson. Robert Leroy Johnson recorded 29 songs in 2 sessions in San Antonio and Dallas in 1936 and 1937, and he died the following year at approximately 27 years old from causes that remain disputed. Those 29 songs are the most mythologized recordings in the history of American music. Johnson was not famous during his lifetime outside the communities where he performed. His records sold modestly. He was a working musician in the Delta tradition, brilliant but not uniquely celebrated among his contemporaries. The myth that grew around him after his death, the deal at the crossroads, the supernatural guitar ability, the cursed short life, was constructed by the blues revival of the 1960s and has been amplified by every subsequent generation of rock musicians who needed an origin myth for the music they built their careers on. He left behind 29 recordings that contain everything the myth claims for them and more, and the proof that 29 songs is enough to change the history of music if the songs are right. Number 1, the musicians who were never recorded. Every name on this list made it onto a record only because a talent scout happened to travel to the right town at the right moment, with equipment that worked, and a company willing to press the sides. For every Blind Lemon Jefferson who was found, there were dozens of musicians of equivalent talent and cultural importance who performed their entire lives without ever being recorded. Their names are unknown. Their music is gone. The blues that shaped American popular music was built by hundreds of people, and history remembers a handful of them. The ones on this list were the fortunate ones. They got to leave something behind. The rest left nothing but a faint impression in the memories of people who heard them once at a fish fry in 1924 and never heard them again. That silence is the real history of American music, not the recordings that survived, but the ones that were never made. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, then watch the next video above